Aye.
Okay, let's go. Let's start. So we're talking about fashion. So a few questions. Where does fashion come from? What is fashion? You know, and how are trends formed? I mean, there's so many different people calling what is fashion for a start. Some people think it's fashion is a trend, fashion is mass produced, fashion is something that changes every season. You know, fashion is haute couture fashion. I don't think it is, because it's one off. You know, is and like, you know, counterculture, I don't think that's a fashion either. And some things are just clothing rather than fashion. But what is fashion? What is fashion to you? You know, do you still call it? Is that word still real? Is that a real word anymore? Do we need to keep saying it's fashion? And how are trends formed, basically? We know that there's a trickle down from high fashion to high street, but bubbling up looks at where the themes of high fashion and couture originate. So taking how, you know, bringing from the street up to the high fashion, really. Yeah. So yeah, so things to discuss. Subverting and challenging the mainstream thinking, pushing boundaries and making statements, looking at fashion as resistance, fashion and resistance to this as a precursor to subcultures, and in turn informs fashion. So I'm just throwing a few things out to think about. Consider the concepts of anti-fashion, the rise of subcultures, and how that links to mainstream fashion. We discuss the theory and the theoretical constructs to identify key issues in the bubbling up of ideas for fashion or trends. Subcultural capital, so what defines a cultural subgroup and what cultural patterns are distinctive of such a group. You think about postmodernism and bricolage, a late 20th century style and concepts in the arts, a departure from modernism, a mixing of different artistic styles and conventions. Bricolage comes from the French word for tinkering and is one of the prevailing techniques of postmodern art, in which the word is composed from a diverse range of available materials. So like artists configure them in unprecedented ways that create new contexts. So I thought that in because of the idea of, you know, the punks and how they brought things together, really odd things, bringing things together, and also the new romantics and any sort of youth culture, really. It tends to come from, it's certainly not something shop bought. The styles are usually brought together by, you know, individual creativity. I've put this in here as well as activism, an example of small knitting scale, a small knitting scale to large scale trend. So we've got street popular culture starting in New York, bubbling up, resisting the mainstream, style to make a statement, the Me Too movement against Trump, and selecting a pink hat for pussy power. It was picked up by the mainstream. The resistance rises, showing how a march becomes a movement. Women sold these hats in America as a symbol of female empowerment, and then the Me Too movement. It's interesting then to look back at the suffragettes. They celebrated conforming in dress style. They wanted to appeal to the eye and celebrated being women, not dressing to make a statement, not wanting to be dressed as a man, not feeling that that was necessary, thinking it was good enough to be a woman dressed as a woman. So they didn't change the way they dressed. They wanted to stand out as women, as equal women to men. So it's interesting that the choice of clothing they made in order to be a suffragette. And then opposite to that, we've got Marlene Dietrich, who channeled the trouser suit look in the 1930s, pioneered by Coco Chanel. She caused a scene at the Oscars when people were shocked to see a woman in trousers. Women don't wear trousers. And at this time, also we had designer Claire McArdle was also asserting independence in designing sportswear. So, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, you think about today with the sort of the non-binary and, you know, everybody sort of having a lot more opportunities to be who they want to be, and being free to be able to do it. But in these days, we're talking about times when it was totally shocking and absolutely outraged to be who you wanted to be. You know, there's certain limits that you could not get away with stuff, but obviously she didn't mind at all. I think she's fantastic, actually. Very nice, very interesting, inspiring woman. And
Didn't
then
she get in trouble when she went to France dressed in them trousers, like to Paris, and she almost get kicked out
they
for
were
it?
all shocked. I don't know the complete story behind it, but I know there was it was an outrage. It was everywhere. So you're right, yeah. She probably did, but she's the sort of actress that probably didn't care, you know. And then I'm thinking about early pioneers of this sort of, you know, being who you want to be, being against the mainstream, being who you want, you know. And I did think of Quentin Crisp, but then I came across this one, and I thought this was interesting. It's one of the original pioneers of androgyny, Radcliffe Hall. I don't know, I haven't actually read any of her stuff, actually, but I do need to now, I want to. I don't know if you know of her. I mean, you see, we all know about Quentin Crisp and people like him, but I didn't know about her at all. So it's quite interesting to look further than the obvious people that are, you know, either celebrated or talked about. There's many other people who have gone through things in life to make ways for us to enjoy life in the current, you know, where we are now. She needed to express her sexual identity through masculine dress and appearance. In the in 1920s, this was really making a very brave statement. Radcliffe Hall wrote The Well of Loneliness, which describes how clothing made her feel. And I think that's an interesting thing about what clothing makes you feel like. Whether you want to be a different sex or not is incidental. It's what does it actually make you feel like. When I'm in my nightie, I can just sort of sit around and be all sloppy and just like cuddly on the settee. You know, if I had a cat, I'd cuddle that. Do you know what I mean? It'd be just but you wouldn't go to work in your nightie. Or, you know, if you got your slippers on, they're so certainly different to a pair of boots. You know, it's like, what does it make you feel different? What does it make you feel like when you're wearing something that's brand new and fabulous? She describes Stephen being a young girl and feeling all wrong. And if she's dressed like a woman, she looked like a man. And if she was dressed like a man, she looked like a woman, wrote Hall. And Stephen began to notice how different clothing made her feel. I thought that's quite interesting. Something you could look back at. And then, of course, we've got Bowie. I'm touching on some people we spoke about last week. The Bowie exhibition at the V&A Museum in 2013. That exhibition sold out even before it opened. A 20th century pioneer of androgyny, showing how music and style are completely linked and influential in setting trends and starting fashion movements. Bowie has inspired many looks through his chameleon attitude to dress and style. And we've got actress Tilda Swinton here. Tilda Swinton adopted the androgynous looks, and along with singer Annie Lennox, who's distinctly inspired by Bowie's sense of style. So these are, you know, more from my generation or from, you know, not your generation necessarily, but be interesting to pick up on who's doing what now as well. And here's Tilda Swinton again, as she appears in the Bowie video for his single, The Stars Are Out Tonight. And I just thought that's so amazing. Yeah, very amazing, interesting, with that switch of sexuality there. And then I came across these two, and I don't know if you know them, two models, Casey Ledger and Andrzej Pejik. Casey Ledger is a French-American writer, model, and former Olympic swimmer, and is the first woman to model a men's collection in 2012. signed by Ford Models Agency to exclusively model men's clothes. She's 43 years old. And I thought that's amazing. I mean, that's just 2012, but I remember seeing that for the first time and being quite shocked. Not shocked, but like, oh God, that's great, sort of shocked. You know, it's like, wow, that's new. So, I mean, nowadays it doesn't feel new at all. But I mean, actually, that was only 2012, so it's not that long ago. And then Andrej Pejic, if I'm pronouncing that right, a Bosnian Australian model. Since coming out as a trans woman in 2013, she has become one of the most recognizable transgender models in the world and is only 29 years old. And it's quite interesting there. I thought that was quite interesting. So we're looking back now with the New Romantics in a time of economic downturn, rising inflation and unemployment. Punk was on its way out. A new generation of club kids emerged, intent on glamorizing their lives. Mostly working class kids and art school students formed a new movement, which was later termed as the New Romantic. Here we have Stephen Jones, the milliner, reminiscing about what he wore for a night out. It was all about the clothes. His father's suit and cream gloves and a cream beret and a pussycat bow. An example of mixing something vintage with own personal touch. And I thought that was really lovely. I mean, it's incidental that he is gay, but he could have been straight actually, because there were many straight boys at that time wearing very similar things. And what I like about it is the old man's suit from the, you know, that his dad's suit, but then he's put on this sort of flamboyant pussy bow tie around his neck. So he's mixing the genders between the two things within one outfit in a way. And I think that's quite charming, that it was all about clothes. I mean, and I remember myself writing a letter to a friend telling her what I was wearing around about the same time, you know, as this in the 80s. And it was such a big thing about what we were wearing. And I wrote a letter because we didn't have mobile phones. My friend lived in Nottingham and I lived in Loughborough. I mean, it's like ridiculous. It's like as if she lived the other side of the world. Whereas, you know,
what was you wearing?
What was I wearing? It was me writing the letter, and I looked for the letter. I've put it somewhere, and I will find it because I've had it out for ages, and I've just lost it now somewhere. But I was wearing a tailed coat that I'd got from Jumble Sale for 20p, like a man's tailed coat. And then I had jodhpurs, like so brownish jodhpurs, obviously male as well. And then I think I had a plastic rain mac on underneath the tailcoat, so like a sort of pink or yellow plastic rain mac with no bra, which I mentioned, as the top. And then I had sparkly socks and a cut-off stilettos, whatever cut-off stilettos are, I don't know, but I can only imagine they're those little tiny 40s little stilettos, do you know, the old-fashioned stilettos. And I thought I was the bee's knees, and you know, and I might have had braces with that as well, with those jodhpurs. But I remember writing clearly, absolutely describing what I was wearing, and then almost saying, and then the other day I was wearing this, and it was it was like so important to be wearing, you know, because it was so shocking in those days. You know, you've got to imagine the 70s and 80s. Well, that, you know, 70s and no, that was 70s actually. But late 70s, but it was, you know, you already imagine the mainstream at that time was probably flicked hair and, you know, very sort of girly, nothing. And this was just something totally different. You wouldn't be seen wearing men's clothes from a Jumble Sale. So, I mean, that was all part of the fun. And it was the early sort of punk days as well, you know, and I suppose in a way we loved shocking. We liked being shocking, but it wasn't just about that. It was about being arty. Being arty rather than, you know, normal, I suppose. So this is from the Guardian newspaper, quoting Stephen Jones. Oh no, wait a minute, have I gone on to the wrong thing? Yeah, I've gone on. What have I just done? Something. I've moved on a bit. Okay, sorry, no. So we've done that one. Clothes were a way of expressing an identity, real or made up. Individuality was key. People didn't have money to spend on branded designs, and they wouldn't wear them anyway. They mixed unexpected items of clothing and wore their friends' designs, and the skill of using whatever is at hand, recombining to create something new. So, I mean, you could see that the girl there with the boa, I mean, you could say, well, the boas were used in the 70s, but they were also used in the 1940s. You know, and you did have boys in zoot suits as well at the time. So there was a real mix of different things. But that whole bricolage idea, I like it. I like it. And this is the article from The Guardian newspaper, quoting Stephen Jones again. On that one, Stephen Linnard at the front there, but he said he met a group of people and entered the melee of London clubland, using clothing to hide insecurities and uncertainties, but enjoying the newfound freedom of self-expression. He goes on to say that when AIDS happened, friends were dying every week and people didn't know if they would live the year out. So you've got all this going on. You've got this really hideous thing about, you know, people dying every week. And I do remember going to a funeral every weekend. And I do remember that for a long period of time. Once AIDS hit, our friends started dropping, and they were all in their 20s, all your age, all young. And it was unbelievable. It was horrendous. But you've got this whole dressing up thing about being in another land, like being a real sort of like, oh my God, we're living this fantasy land. And then there's that happening, which is so serious. So it was quite strange. But it also meant that people really formed friendships at that time, because it was just an unreal time to go through at that age, you see. You know, and our parents obviously couldn't understand any of it as well, you know, any of that. So it was a sort of family of misfits, like I said last week. There was a kind of ritual, dressing up and going to the same clubs every night to meet your friends. You knew that the same people would be there every night, and a kind of private club. He talks about hijacking the girls' loos, boys who would be girls. And that reminds me, does that say it on there? Yeah, it does. Boys who would be girls hijacking the loos. And that reminds me of the Mary Quant exhibition, actually, because at the V&A also, that has been on, about the collection, about the 60s collection of girls who will be boys. And I think that's really interesting, because even if you go back to the 60s, you've got Mary Quant working with what would be known as suiting fabrics, like woven suiting fabrics, pinstripe suits, and this types of fabrics that men's business suits would have been in. And almost like these girls are sort of taking the piss a bit of the businessmen, because they're making them, she made these little tiny little dresses in these business suits, and called them names by, like, one of them was called the something bank or something or other, and it was all about really taking the mickey out of the businessmen, but also bringing into play in a comedy way. Actually, it was more fun, but yeah, bringing in girls' clothes, that girls could be boys, you know. So that's also related in a way to what we're talking about. Pierre Bourdieu, if I'm pronouncing that right, writes about distinctions of taste, and I thought this was quite interesting. So what is good taste and what is bad taste? I mean, you know, they say the upper classes supposedly have good taste, conservative and good quality, and then the lower classes apparently wear gaudy, cheap clothing and too much makeup, etc. So what about subculture then? Although they're mostly working class kids, this sits outside of these levels of tastes. It rebels against the norm. So I don't believe it is good taste or bad taste. It's good style or bad style. I mean, you can, you know, not everybody was brilliant. Not everybody was brilliant at it, but I think the people who were good at, that looked good, were the ones that were authentic, that weren't doing it just, they were doing it because they just had to do it. They had to wear what they were wearing. It was authentic. It was coming from, they weren't trying to copy anybody or trying to fit in with anybody. They just did it their own style. And authenticity is always, you know, has a good style, doesn't it, really? I mean, it's real. What influences and inspirations did the New Romantics have? They had David Bowie, who was inspired by the kabuki theatre, and had wonderful designs made for him by the designer Kanzai Yamamoto. I think he's just recently died, actually, which is a real shame. He's really beautiful, beautiful clothing designer. Designs influenced by kabuki theatre here. This fantastic vinyl bodysuit, made in 1973, was seen at David Bowie's exhibition at the V&A Museum in 2013. And if you look at the makeup on the theatrical person there, you can see it again here. And Boy George was inspired by Bowie, but then in turn then was inspired by the kabuki theatre. So it's like today when you see students who were inspired by Lee Bowery, for instance, I say, well, don't look at Lee Bowery, look at what Lee Bowery was inspired by. Look at beyond that, what were they inspired by, and do something original. Taking on the makeup and the bold traditional dress sense, the white pan makeup was a key feature for the New Romantics. And as seen here, the geisha girl look, the theatrical appearance, looking like a picture, an image. From the 60s, bouffant, the old style Hollywood, glam mixed with kabuki theatre influences. And of course, pre-Instagram, as I keep saying, pre-mobile phones, pre-computers. So the Face and the Blitz and ID were the main magazines. If you managed to get into one of these, you were made, basically. These magazines were our Instagram. They were more, by our age group at that time, like your age group, they were much more highly prized than, say, Vogue was. Vogue was very mainstream at the time. You may have some high fashion designers in there and some good bits, but mainly it was mainstream for people who had lots of money. Whereas these magazines were different. Inside these pages, they're reporting more underground information. These were our social spaces as well. So everybody had these magazines. Every time it came out, we were looking to see who we knew. And that was far more important than seeing some big, you know, hotshot model in Vogue that was just not part of our lifestyle. And we wouldn't want to be wearing those clothes anyway. These magazines photographed us, ordinary people who were not ordinary, but also celebrity, not about celebrity, sorry, sharing wealth. It's not about wealth at all. It was about what was going on with us in our social spaces. Vogue, as I said, to me was quite dull in the 80s. These aren't 80s though, this is 2012 and 2003. And you can see here though, I'm just thinking now, bringing Bowie back in, how we're talking still about how underground or the street style has influenced fashion and main trends still in a roundabout sort of way. And how Bowie is still maintaining influence and how very much in the mainstream he is now for not being mainstream. Kate Moss as David Bowie bubbling up into high fashion, showing evolution of street style. And subcultures and birth of street style here. Okay, yeah, so from the jazz age, rock and roll of the 50s and the 60s revolution to punks in the 70s and the raves of the 90s, Polemus writes that it's about being in the right place at the right time, hanging out and making history. And that's an interesting thing as well, because it's not something that you can just make or do or be or make it happen or force something to happen. These little sort of, I don't know what you call them, like areas of trends, or they're not really, I don't know if it's a trend, but it's these happenings, these subcultures come about because of what's going on around you, and we just happen to be in the right place at the right time, and there was enough of those people feeling the same. And also, you know, as well, you need to have a place, it needs to be in the right place as well. So it's interesting because I was reading something from somebody called Barry Miles, and it's called London's Calling, and it takes you back to when the 1940s, when the jazz bars and the saloon bars and all of that was open, and that people were hanging out, like the poets and the actors and the writers and the artists, and the prostitutes were around and all of that. It was very, very exciting and sort of daring and everything else. But that sort of atmosphere came about only because there was enough poverty artists who were in poverty that wanted to hang around together in those, not poverty, but yeah, I mean, you know, they didn't have money, but because none of those people had money until much later when they all died. Well, some, I don't know. I mean, we know them now, but they weren't known then necessarily. But what I'm trying to say is, it was at a time, you know, there needs to be enough bars and cafes around, and enough cheap accommodation as well around, in order to provide an environment for these people to be in this way of being. It couldn't happen, say, in, you know, West Kensington or something. It has to happen in a time and a place. It's very important, you know, and it's look, really. So what have I got here? Post-war employment and increased levels of youth affluence. So looking back, so certainly affected, the youth affluence certainly affected the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. That started to change things again, giving young people a chance to be young, opening up opportunities for them, and not just doing what their parents did. So we're talking about the 50s and 60s. I am here. There was a newfound confidence in young people. Music had a significant influence, and there was a growth of small businesses and making clothes and custom-made clothing, and that happened in the 60s, 50s and 60s, coming up. And also this is just before, you know, my time, I suppose, in all of this. But it's letting you think about what's happening. And what I'm trying to say is what sparks these things off. The stylistic boundaries between subcultures and fashion are certainly blurred, and it's important to think about social spaces and where these ideas are formed. That's what, again, we'll come back to the social spaces. So ideas are formed. I think I said last week that your identity is somewhat formed by the people that you're with as well, and who you associate with. Some images of the Andrew Logan's alternative Miss World here, which was a magnet for personalities with extraordinary ideas and sense of style. Here you can see ideas being picked up by French Femme magazine in 1983 and the Tatler magazine in 1989. We got this image of Scarlett with a supermodel, which was a shocking contrast. I mean, to look at it now, I don't know what I think of it anymore, really, but her hair and her tattoo and even her height was considered ugly by the mainstream. And it was shocking to see that you got the you know, the quintessential beautiful tall model, and then you've got Scarlett there, and it although she's not really shocking to us now, that was shocking then. And then you've got Andrew Logan and Scarlett being used to promote Stella Beer in 1989. So taking from alternative Miss World, who most mainstream people would shun, but then using them here in Tatler magazine, you know, to advertise beer. It's very strange. But also, you know, with fashion, there is a zeitgeist. So you think bubbling up, or ideas are in the air. You can quite often, sometimes you can go to one university and be teaching something, and you see something in somebody's pages, and then you go to another university and you see something in their sketchbook pages, and you think, do you know what, they've not seen each other, they don't know each other, but they're both thinking about the same sort of thing. And it's not about copying anything, or it's just something that's in the air. It's a zeitgeist, something that makes things happen, that people are looking at the same inspiration. So it's very interesting, the similarities and connections that can be made, even just in these three images here. So you've got the first one, which is Clubland, which is a one-off dress, a dress for a man, and that's in the club. And there's a leather piece with the straps and buckles and bits and pieces going on. And then you've got this sort of small boutique here, which is the small boutique, is Swanky Modes in the middle, which is more like small runs of a style. So they will be making, you know, the first one's a one-off, and then this one, they'd probably have about 6 to 12 of those garments made up in their own little boutique. And then you've got the large designer brand and Azzedine Alaya, which I absolutely love. But there you go. Then you've got that. And none of these people were copying any. They weren't copying. It wasn't copied from each other. It was just something that was about, and it was something that people picked up on. And it might have been to do with, well, we're talking early 80s. So punk was still around and just fading. But so there was you know, the thing about the buckles and the belts, and maybe a bit of the sort of type of very bondagey type feel about that in a glamorous evening dressy way. There's something there. Even Zandra Rhodes did the safety pins down the side of a dress, which was a very floaty girly thing. Which I think, what's the name, picked it up. What's the name? The woman that was married to Hugh Grant also.
Liz Hurley.
Yeah, what's the name?
Liz Hurley, but I think that it was I can't remember the brand though.
She certainly, well, yeah, that might have been Azzedine Alaya. It might have been Azzedine Alaya, but that was much later though, wasn't it? Much later. But you see, these things, they're not really in fashion, so they're not out of fashion. It's like, if this isn't a fashion, is it? Because it's not in fashion. What's fashion? Anyway, what is fashion? Anyway, that's another whole question. But here we've got Bowie's influence continuing to inspire. Jonathan Saunders menswear collection, 2013. 2013, yeah, the thin white Duke. So, I mean, that's definitely inspired by David Bowie. And here again, Givenchy's 2010 collection and David Bowie in 1973. So, you know, he continues to inspire. He wasn't in fashion. It was his own thing. We can't talk about this. We can't talk about fashion and clothing and stuff without bringing in Madonna. So, you know, that cone-shaped bra was a statement of female empowerment. Madonna's pink satin cone bra made its first appearance through strategically placed slits on a black Jean Paul Gaultier suit as she emerged on stage during her Blonde Ambition tour in 1990, famously saying, art should be controversial, and that's all there is to it. And you know, I think that's quite interesting to say that. She told the New York Times days before the release of Like a Prayer, which was intentionally controversial. She was being intentionally controversial. And then it caused Pepsi to drop plans to use the song in a commercial. So she actually lost a $5 million contract for saying that, famously saying art should be controversial and that's all there is to it. And that is in the 90s, and she lost $5 million contract. So, I mean, I think we've come a long way since the 90s, to be honest, because, I mean, it's not that, I mean, I don't know what's wrong with saying that, to be honest. I don't know.
You say that, but then you also have a lot of snowflakes that get offended over the most smallest of comments as well. So,
well, we do seem to be in an era of people being very, very easily offended. That definitely is true.
Well, it's more, I think it's a human emotion to be offended. You're allowed to be offended, but people get offended and then they post it all over Instagram like, you're not allowed to offend me, all over whatever. It's like, well, no, that's questionable.
It is fashionable. I think it is a bit of a trend to be offended, but and I'm not saying you shouldn't be offended, but yeah, I mean, that's a whole conversation. So save that till the end. So the world of Jean Paul Gaultier, from the sidewalk to the catwalk, was an exhibition celebrating 35 years of creation at the Barbican exhibition 2014. He was described as an enfant terrible, I'm not pronouncing my French very well, to enfant terrible of the fashion industry, and is known for his unconventional designs. I know you all know who he is, but, you know, was always in the underground clubs in the 80s and 90s and gathering inspiration from the club kids of that time. And I know for a fact that he gathered information, you know, the Chronicle bra was definitely picked up from the club scene of the 80s. Jean-Paul Gaultier's Spring-Summer 2013 collection is here, lining up some of the most influential pop stars of the 80s. So the 80s seem to keep coming back and back, because they're not fashion. It's not fashion, it's just style, as far as I can see, my point of view. It's not about something that goes in and out of fashion, but fashion might pick up on elements of it. You've got Bowie there, then Annie Lennox in the middle, and Boy George. So this is definitely bubbling up. Those people wore those things in clubs to start with, and underground, and it's starting to now become high fashion. So if it's high fashion, then it will definitely trickle down into the mainstream at some point. So, you know, John Galliano was one of the world's most controversial and creative talents. He currently oversees the design of Margiela lines, including couture and women's wear, ready to wear. He graduated from Central St Martin's in '88. He was around in the club scene at that time too. His first collection, inspired by the French Revolution, was bought in its entirety for sale in Brown's Boutique, London. A lot of people say that he actually copied Vivienne Westwood, but you know, he's still very talented anyway. He too was an original club kid, gathered inspiration from his peers. And yeah, so that's that. Yeah, so okay, so he gathered information from his peers. So when does something underground become mainstream? When someone from the underground grows and makes it mainstream. So that's the other thing, like with, say, Lee McQueen. Interesting, I suppose. The more money he managed to get or be sponsored by, or the more opportunities he had to show his ideas, it certainly became what is mainstream. It's not mainstream as in mass production, but it's mainstream as in people know who he is. He's not underground just doing it in his club scene. He's had the opportunity to explore it in a wider level, his ideas, and much money spent on it in order for people to take notice, I suppose. So you think about what is mainstream. Is mainstream something that everybody knows about? Like I said last week about RuPaul's Drag Race is now mainstream. Men wearing dresses is now mainstream. You could say it's not mainstream in the streets, like we don't see it all day long every day, but it is something that's acceptable on television. That's interesting. So is it mainstream? It certainly isn't underground anymore. So does that make it mainstream? I don't know. There's a lot of words there that you've got to be really careful about what these words mean, really, haven't you? Like mainstream and fashion and trends. Are high fashion brands mainstream, even though they are just for the elite? Or is mainstream just for the high street and the affordable for everybody? When does something become a fashion item, not just about styling? The difference between fashion and style. What is the difference between fashion and style? And here we've got some images of some punks hanging out with appropriated objects, the beer bottle, the telephone box, being in the street, reflecting the lifestyle. So obviously we've got Vivienne Westwood there and a group, but it's about the lifestyle. Him sitting there with that bottle in his mouth, that's part of the look, isn't it? That's part of the look. It's part of their lifestyle. So it's like, and it's about hanging outside in the street as well, is part of their lifestyle. So what makes taste, or levels of taste? These are hanging out in the street, probably the King's Road, and interrupting the process of what is thought to be as normal. So if you're walking down the King's Road and you saw that lot there, which you did, you know, it wasn't normal. It wasn't normal to the normal person walking down the street. But it's not necessarily, is it a fashion? It's not fashion, but in a mainstream sense. I don't know. Anyway, there's lots of questions there. We're nearly there. So Polemus writes about fashion and questions notions of fashion and style and anti-fashion. So where one begins and the other one ends. What makes fashion what makes fashion? Is anti-fashion a style? Lots to think about. So we're bringing Zandra Rhodes. Of course, she picked up on the punk movement and hijacked design details for her otherwise floaty dresses. So she wasn't really thought of as a punk at all, but she picked up on those safety pins, and she had pink hair, but her dresses were very mainstream. They were nice. I mean, you had people like Shirley Bassey wearing them, you know, but they weren't considered punk. This was about one of the best things I think she did, the conceptual wedding dress, conceptual chic. 1977, the wedding dress, reflecting Elsa Schiaparelli's famous Tears dress. So Schiaparelli did a dress which she called Tears dress from 1938. So it was torn, studded, had crystals, and it was made out of rayon. The collection offered more refined take on the rips and chains and safety pins that then adorned the punks in the King's Road in London. So you can think now here, she's bringing it to a more influential audience. So you've got like Shirley Bassey. I don't suppose she wore this one, but she will have been wearing that sort of thing there, that, you know, the printed stuff. But, you know, those sort of maybe older clientele would have been actually thinking, okay, we can buy these because, you know, Zandra Rhodes, we've bought stuff from her before. She was credited as the first to integrate punk aesthetic into luxury fashion. She admitted that she was responding to the zeitgeist inspired by the vibrations in the air. Excuse me. I mean, you should look at Judy Blame. In fact, he's recently died as well, actually. But he is a very great stylist that you could look him up, Judy Blame, and he's done a lot of this sort of thing with chains and bits and pieces like this, sort of necklaces and odd accessory pieces, which is quite nice to look at and be inspired by. So anyway, there's Zandra Rhodes. She's got 50 years of fabulous fashion and textiles exhibition, was held at the Fashion Textiles Museum in 2019. And it brought a new appreciation of her work. It was a very small exhibition, and there were some nice bits in there. And those prints there are currently on sale of her designs, and that is she's definitely got a signature, the punk illustrations. They're watercolors of a 1976 collection, Conceptual Chic, that earned her the title of Princess of Punk, and which saw her take the subculture into high fashion and popularize embellished safety pins, chains, and embroidered holes. So that was, and then I'm just bringing, as I mentioned Mary Quant earlier, the message of girls will be boys is an interesting one. We had boys will be girls earlier, now we've got girls will be boys. Mary Quant was Britain's most iconic fashion designer in the 60s. Her mission was to create clothes that could be worn by anyone and everyone, street style at an unaffordable price. So she was the one credited for bringing in like street style, you know, mass production stuff, really, because before that, I think before the 60s, you had like, you know, you had lots and lots of dressmakers making clothes for you, and people would wear the same as their parents wore. And this sort of gave young people the opportunity to buy something that was cheap enough for them to buy and be different to what their parents wore. So while they have a 60s conventional look to them, her designs were incredibly forward-thinking. She took inspiration from formal men's tailoring, which I've said, with the use of pinstripe twill, reminiscent of the male styles and named after British banking institutions, a highly male-dominated field. This was a statement because during this time, women could not even open a bank account without a male relative's permission. And that's the 60s, for God's sake. And I think further afield to fashion, but what about artists as well? Frida was born in Mexico City in 1907, Frida Kahlo. From a very early age, she suffered illness and had to endure constant operations. her loneliness and human suffering was reflected in her paintings. And the V&A exhibition, I keep mentioning these V&A exhibitions because they're brilliant, the exhibitions that they put on, really good to see. And they really cause a stir somehow. And this one was based on the 2004 discovery of Frida Kahlo's clothing and personal possessions, including a plaster corset and prosthetic legs. This resulted in new trends, and I think we can safely call this trends. Traditional Mexican clothing, which in turn inspired Mexican prints and embroideries, statement jewelry, and wearing flowers in the hair. Mexican culture is without a doubt one that strongly resonates. And I do remember people suddenly wearing flowers in their hair a lot, and that was at the time when this exhibition was on. There was a little flurry of people wanting flowery headbands and things. So we're nearly there now. And then again, you see, so when are we talking? That was 2012. But, you know, she's another one that keeps coming back in, because in 1998, both Christian Lacroix and Jean-Paul Gaultier paid homage to Frida Kahlo with their spring-summer collections. So Rui Kawakabu for Comme des Garçons later created a dress for his spring-summer 2012 collection entitled White Drama, referencing her works of art. So Frida Kahlo was a pioneer, trendsetter, and eccentric street style. She confused the crowds with her eclectic outfits, extravagant headpieces, and religious iconic jewelry. And then just to finish on a rather funny one, when you think about, well, it's quite funny. When you think about trends and people picking up on stuff, you know, and even just, I mean, I suppose now we've got so many things to pick things up from, like media, you know, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, everything. But this Peaky Blinders thing, it's quite interesting. You know, we're talking about a flurry of flowers with Frida Kahlo, and suddenly we've got this British drama series that follows the exploits of Shelby crime family in the direct aftermath of World War I, set in the 20s Birmingham. Became extremely popular with mainstream viewers, male and female. And then we get this, how to get the best Peaky Blinders haircut. So it is interesting, isn't it, how coming from the street, okay, this is a television program, but it's built on historical accuracy, you know, of those characters from that time, which were majority working class on the street. And then we've sort of glamorized it in a film, and then suddenly everybody wants these Peaky Blinders haircuts, including my son. An example of setting trends through popular media, but interestingly, a theme of working class heroes. So youth subcultures have paved the way for street style to move from being a subversive cultural movement towards becoming a global phenomenon. The street is where identity can be played out as an individual, and the urban environment serves as its creative space to perform. Da, 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 da. Oh, we've got that. I don't know whether that works, actually. Oh, should we see?